It is June 22nd, 1941, and Germany just began their three-prong attack on the Soviet Union with a goal of reaching Stalingrad, Moscow, and Leningrad. One day later, one of the largest tank battles of the war would commence. Operation Barbarossa was the largest invasion in history, with roughly 3.8 million Axis troops crossing the border into Soviet territory. This operation brought along a number of tank engagements, including the Battle of Brody, which took place in Ukraine from June 23rd to June 30th, 1941, between the towns of Brody, Dubno, and Lutsk. It was launched as a counterattack against the Wehrmacht Panzer Group 1, who invaded the day prior. The German forces held roughly 730 tanks, consisting mostly of light tanks including the Panzer I and Panzer IIs, but also held a comparatively small number of Panzer III medium tanks. They also held a number of tanks from other nations, such as Czechoslovakia, and captured tanks from the Allied powers. Contrary to common belief, tanks were normally not specifically designed for tank-on-tank combat, and were instead used to destroy fortifications as well as support troops through enemy fire. As a result of this, most tanks at the time were mounted with smaller sized weapons, often being between 20mm and 50mm, while also carrying a much smaller amount of armor. For example, the Panzer II light tank, which was considered the primary workhorse of the German army in the early war, held only a 20mm cannon as well as 30 to 35mm of frontal armor. The counterattacking Soviet army had a staggering 3,500 ready tanks at the start of the battle. These tanks consisted mostly of BT series tanks, such as the BT-7, as well as the T-26. These tanks held 37mm and 45mm cannons respectively. However, they had extremely thin armor, with the T-26 having only 15mm on the front plate, making it extremely susceptible to most anti-tank weapons at the time. However, the BT series tanks did have the added benefit of being extremely fast for its time, having between 30 miles per hour and 50 miles per hour depending on terrain. The counterattacking Red Army, composed of 6 motorized corps, being the 4th, 8th, 9th, 15th, 19th, and the 22nd Motorized, commanded by Mikhail Petrovich, held a limited number of KV-1 heavy tanks, as well as the famous T-34 medium tank. Both the KV-1 and the T-34 boasted comparatively large 76mm cannons that provided powerful anti-tank roles in the early 1940s. The KV-1 had between 75 and 90mm of armor, which made it nearly impervious to all German weapons at the time. The T-34 incorporated a massive technological leap with a 60-degree sloped armor that often made rounds ricochet out the front plate, while also giving the benefit of more protection with less materials used. This design philosophy is still used on every single modern tank of today. Although these designs were monumental at the time, they were brought down by the poor design of tank ammunition. The poor design of tank shells in the Soviet Union at the time caused many to shatter on impact instead of penetrating. This made many of the rounds useless against enemy armor, making a huge downside for the Soviet tankers. As the battle began, it became apparent of the sheer lack of preparedness from the Soviet army. Command structure crumbled as the ill-prepared troops went fighting, some of them not even in uniform. Soviet forces were swiftly pushed back as German troops sprinted towards strategic points. Red Army forces attempted a number of counterattacks, with one of them being the triangle between Brody, Dubno, and Lutsk. German forces were tasked with advancing deep into the territory in northern Ukraine in order to capture the strategically important city of Kiev. However, this counterattack quickly broke down as Soviet forces were overwhelmed and outmaneuvered. This led to many units getting attritioned as a lack of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts forced many units to be abandoned. This crumbling attack was further exacerbated as early the day prior, German forces launched a surprise attack on the Soviet air bases, destroying hundreds of aircraft before they're even deployed. This left air superiority firmly in the hands of the Luftwaffe. This allowed German pilots to quickly down surveillance aircraft, leaving commanders blind as Ju-87s, also known as Stukas, gave heavy ground support. bazookas were effective at both killing and devastating morale for enemy troops, as the pilots incorporated flying artillery tactics. Flying artillery consisted of low-flying, close-air support planes that would fly near to the ground, destroying units, tanks, and fortifications. As the battle furthered, many Soviet vehicles became abandoned, as it was nearly impossible to maintain them under these conditions. One Soviet corps became encircled, losing nearly all of its vehicles, with only a small number of troops surviving. In total, the Soviet forces lost roughly 2,600 tanks of the starting 3,500, with the majority being lost due to logistical reasons, forcing the Red Army to further retreat. Although the Wehrmacht also suffered significant losses, they were still able to continue their push towards Kiev, with Bf-109s and Ju-87s in the air for further support. We now move down to North Africa, where one of the most famous battles in history would take place, being the Second Battle of El Alamein, the face-off between two famous leaders, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and British Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery. This battle quickly became famous due to a list of factors, with Rommel being infamous due to his key role during the invasion of France, as well as marking a major turning point in the North African theater. Rommel, nicknamed the Desert Fox, was known as a pioneer of the famous Blitzkrieg tactic, where he would use a mix of armored forces and motorized units to overwhelm and outmaneuver his adversaries. This allowed him to sever supply and communication networks, turning formidable opponents into bogged-down forces. He was able to efficiently command many forms of weaponry, including anti-air, anti-tank, and armored forces to quickly force enemies into retreat. This was very different from Montgomery, or Monty as his soldiers called him, who often preferred using very long, carefully devised strategies to turn odds in his favor. Montgomery would often position himself in ways that forced enemies to condense themselves down into small pockets. This would allow him to use an overwhelming fire doctrine to destroy large chunks of enemy forces. This would allow him to put his units into safe positions, allowing for a lower risk to his own units while actively destroying enemy forces in large numbers. Both of these tactics were powerful under the correct circumstances, but were designed in ways that only one could prevail under specific conditions. Erwin Rommel was famous among his troops, who looked up to him as a very powerful figure. This was also true for the army under Montgomery, who were always looking forward to Rommel's next move. Montgomery knew this when he was deployed to the battlefield in August of 1942, knowing he needed to prove himself to gain the respect of his soldiers. He was given command over the 8th Army after his predecessor, Claude Auchinleck, was removed due to poor morale and command over his troops. Montgomery was not the first choice of replacement, with that title going to Lieutenant General William Gott, who was tragically killed when his transport aircraft was shot down by the Luftwaffe on August 7th. However, almost immediately after Montgomery's arrival in North Africa, he made a number of changes, starting with the destruction of all plans of retreat. He also began a number of acts, including a speech to his troops boosting morale, a reorganizing effort, and he also hung a signed picture of Erwin Rommel, his rival, in his caravan to help him keep his mind on the battlefield. Before we go over each army, we need to understand the importance of this battle. Alamein was a key target for the Axis army due to it being the perfect hub to make a new supply chain that could end Rommel's over 500-mile connection that caused immense strain on his whole force. It was also a heavily defended area that, if broken, would allow for the push towards the Suez Canal, as well as being able to take control of the Middle Eastern oil fields. This battle would be extremely difficult, however, due to it being a small 40-mile wide bottleneck between the Mediterranean and the impassable Qatar Depression. Rommel had attempted an assault on El Alamein the month prior, however was unable to make any meaningful advances, so he decided to retreat to his earlier lines. This is where the Second Battle of El Alamein would begin, with Rommel using this time after the attack to begin a long set of fortifications with over 500,000 landmines along with miles of barbed wire, nicknamed the Devil's Garden. Both of these armies were formidable, however the Allied army held a pure numerical advantage with 195,000 troops to the Axis 116,000. The Allied forces also consisted of nearly double the amount of armored units with 1,000 to 550. This was carried further by the Allies holding air superiority in the region. The Axis forces, also named the Panzer Army Africa, was a mix of Italian and German units composed with a mix of infantry, armored, and motorized infantry divisions. The Allied forces held only infantry and armored divisions with a few brigades from Greece and Free France. The Axis armored forces were a mix of mostly Panzer III and Panzer IV medium tanks, with Panzer IIs as reconnaissance, with a mix of Italian armor like the Embarrassment, that is the L335 tankette, as well as a mix of M13-40s and M14-41 medium tanks. The German armor was mostly used in support roles for infantry, using howitzer-designed cannons instead of long-barreled high-velocity cannons, making them largely ineffective against Allied armor. However, Rommel did hold a smaller number of Panzer III and Panzer IVs with long-barreled 50mm and 75mm cannons. The 50mm KWK L60 mounted on the Panzer III was somewhat inefficient against the sloped armor of the M3 and M4 American tanks, which meant they normally needed to be relatively close for the run to penetrate. On the other hand, the 75mm KWK 40 used on the Panzer IV was extremely effective, being able to penetrate the angled front plate of the M4 Sherman from over 1,500 meters. This cannon was one of the best of the war, being used from 1942 to 1945, mounted on mostly the Panzer IV and the Sturmgeschütz III, making them very potent anti-tank weapons. The Panzer IV was exceptional for its era in the late 30s and early 40s, with its large 3-man turret that reduced workload on the commander, while also providing the room for a large 75mm cannon. The 75mm cannon was a massive improvement over the 50mm on the Panzer III, which shot the standard PZGR-39, which was an APC-BC round, which stands for Armor-Piercing Capped Ballistic Capped. This round was a standard armor-piercing round with a multi-cap design meant to bend and force the round down, increasing performance against sloped armor. However, this cap decreased aerodynamics, reducing performance, so another cap would be placed on top to help reduce this fact. This round was already extremely effective. However, there would also be a small amount of explosive filler set on the inside, set to a timed fuse that would explode inside the vehicle, causing a significant amount of damage. When shot from the 50mm cannon, this round was largely ineffective. However, when paired with the 75mm cannon on the Panzer IV, it became very hard hitting with over 3 times as much penetration, being able to go through 127 to 109mm from a distance of 500 to 1000 meters. In comparison, the standard M61 round used on the 75mm M3, mounted on both the M3 Lee and M3 Grant, as well as the early M4 Shermans, could penetrate between 95 and 86mm, or even as low as 73mm at 1000 meters, depending on armor type. In reality, both 75mm guns could easily penetrate the front plate of the opposition, meaning tactics and mobility mattered more in this case. Now that the main vehicles are covered, let's move to the battle. Alamein was fought in 3 main spots within Devil's Garden, being Kidney and Maitreya Ridge, as well as the Municid Depression. Montgomery planned to push through the minefields using engineer corps to flag passage through. He would then push into the north with 5 infantry divisions and later 3 armored divisions. Eventually, after multiple failed counterattacks and supplies running short, Rommel announced a retreat, putting an end to the North African campaign. This ended all hope of gaining access to the Suez Canal, as well as the Middle Eastern oil fields.